Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 more cases of people who completely vanished in a short period of time. And despite almost immediate and extensive searches, not a single trace of them has been found. Well, almost. You'll see what I mean in the final story. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On Friday, September 25th, 1981, Thelma Pauline Melton was walking along the Deep Creek Trail in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. This was an area she'd been coming to every summer for almost 20 years, and so it was a trail she was familiar with and had walked many times. At the time, Thelma was 58 and retired, and she was walking with 2 friends of hers who were part of a group that was staying in the campground together. At about 4 p.m., as they walked along, her 2 friends teased her a little bit because she seemed to be walking slower than normal and was falling a bit behind. Then, as if to show them up, Thelma sped up and passed them. They then commented on how fast she was now going, and Thelma looked back and laughed and kept going. When she was about 75 yards from them, she crested a small hill and then was out of sight, and strangely, this was the last time Thelma was ever seen. As they got to the hill a few seconds later, they expected to see her along the pathway, but there was no sign of her. It is a heavily forested trail with some twists and turns and small hills, so that wasn't all that weird. Then, not thinking much of it, they figured she'd just returned to the trailer where her husband Robert was. So they continued on and reached the trailer less than 30 minutes later, only to find that she wasn't there either and Robert hadn't seen her since they left. Getting slightly more alarmed by then, Robert made some calls to see if she'd gone to any of the trailers nearby. Meanwhile, the 2 friends told their husbands, who left immediately to retrace their steps along the trail. They quickly went the entire distance, and although there were lots of people, there was no trace of Thelma. They would even ask all the other people they saw on the way if they'd seen anyone matching Thelma's description, but not a single person had seen her either. Finally, an hour and a half later, when it was clear this was serious, they called the police and officially reported her missing. Police arrived shortly afterward, and a thorough search was started, and over the course of 4 days, kept the trail closed and scoured the area. In total, this ended up being 100 miles of trails, with over 100 searchers and dog teams on the pathways and in the forests. Unfortunately, after everything, there was nothing. No signs of a struggle, no scent, and no sign of Thelma. Now, that day, she left the trail without her ID, wallet, and keys. The only thing she had with her was her cigarettes. In addition, she was on medication for high blood pressure and nausea, which she had also left in the trailer. Because she had none of her essential items, and because she was a 2-pack-a-day smoker who couldn't walk very far or very fast, police initially suspected foul play. Maybe she had been abducted by someone along the trail. The problem with this idea, though, as police quickly learned, was that Thelma was not a small woman. She was 5'10", 180 pounds. She wouldn't have been an easy target, especially not in such a short period of time on a trail with a bunch of other people. She almost certainly would have yelled or something had she been attacked. So after realizing this, police began to explore the possibility that maybe Thelma had chosen to disappear. In this part of the investigation, there were some interesting findings, but unfortunately they only added to the mystery. The first thing was that Thelma had prepared a sauce for dinner earlier that day that she intended to have with Robert later. This seems to indicate that she expected to be back. The next weird thing is that in the 4 years prior to her disappearance, Thelma volunteered to hand out food to the elderly during the week. And she did this every day without missing a day for as long as Robert could remember. Except on the day she disappeared, for some unknown reason, she decided not to go in. In addition to that, in those 4 years, she had never once used the phone there. On the day before she disappeared, she had used the phone and made a call to someone unknown, and what they talked about is also unknown. The only other piece of information about her case that seems notable is that her pastor, who she confided in, said that Thelma had been struggling with the loss of her mother earlier that year. He would also claim that he believed she was having an affair. Now, to be clear, this has never been substantiated and there is no evidence to support this, but either way, it's led to speculation. People have suggested that Thelma may have been unhappy with her life, married to a man who was 20 years older than her. Because of the age difference, her husband Robert was far less mobile and active than she was. So operating on this theory, it's been suggested that the call was to this partner to plan her escape the following day. At the same time, this seems far-fetched, and the moments leading up to her disappearance seem far too organic. This would mean that Thelma had to act completely normal, then decide to go on that hike at exactly the right time, then speed up at exactly the right time, and have someone waiting to pick her up. You'd think there would be some sort of nervousness or apprehension detected by either her friends or her husband that day. So that leaves us with 3 possibilities. The first is that she was truly lost in the woods. This trail is on the edge of the mountains filled with dense forests and creeks and rivers. The second is that she was maybe abducted in broad daylight on a trail with lots of other people. And the third is that she chose to disappear, and it was carefully planned to make it seem as though she was lost. To this day, there is no trace of Thelma. Captain Penny Osmond was a guard commander in the medevac helicopter unit of the National Guard. She liked a challenge, and one of the biggest challenges she knew of was the Mountain Marathon race in Seward near Anchorage, Alaska. The race is only about 3 miles long, but the first mile and a half or so is spent ascending the 3,000-foot peak of the mountain. The rest is treacherous scrambling back down the steep cliffs you just came up. It's one of the toughest races in the world, and it's open to anyone. According to legend, the race began when two miners argued about whether getting up and down the mountain in less than an hour was possible. The two decided that the only way to settle the bet was to run the route with the loser promising to pay for drinks of anyone who came to watch. Then, to make that round of drinks as big as possible, they decided to run on the 4th of July, drawing a large Independence Day crowd. The miner who believed it to be possible would miss the 1-hour target by 2 minutes and ultimately lost the bet, but he turned out to be correct anyway. Since the race's official start in 1915, quite a few people have managed it in less than an hour, and today the course record is 41 minutes and 26 seconds. In 2012, Penny thought she could get into the top third of competitors and took the run seriously. Before the race, she walked the route, ensuring she knew where all the dangerous spots were, when to be careful, and when to go for it. This was important. Although the path was worn, the route isn't marked, and a wrong turn can be dangerous, even deadly. On the day of the race, the weather wasn't great, and a constant drizzle of rain made the rocky terrain slippery, and parts of the mountain were covered in fog. Even so, Penny made good time up the hill and started the long scramble down until she reached a steep rock face. This was one of the most challenging parts of the course, and crowds would gather at the bottom to watch the runners carefully make their way down. There were also 2 routes down from there. Peggy was sure that the left side as you come down was more manageable, but then almost as soon as she started to make her way down, she lost her footing and began to slip down the cliff face. She managed to steady herself for a moment by leaning back on the rock and trying to push herself back up with her hands, but every time she tried, she slid a little more, slipping from one rock formation to another. Eventually, she saw tree roots sticking out the side of the cliff and thought she could jump toward them to stop her fall, so she launched herself at them, reaching out to grab them, but unfortunately didn't even graze them with her fingertips. Then she fell 15 feet toward the ground back first. A woman at the bottom ran toward the cliff and tried to break Penny's fall, and she did slightly, but Penny still smashed into the ground, hitting her head and torso. Luckily, she was still conscious, so the woman held on to her and stabilized her while they waited for a medevac to fly her out. Penny would then go on to spend 6 weeks in the hospital with lacerations and broken ribs, and the spot where she fell turned out to be dangerous. Later, another runner named Matthew Kenny fell so hard he broke his arm and his skull, knocking him unconscious for days. Penny and Matthew also weren't the first or the last people to be badly injured in the race. There were reports of people breaking limbs, lacerated in their organs after getting impaled on trees, and even narrowly escaping from bears. But all of them fully recovered, and some even went on to compete again. The one man who didn't, or at least we don't think he did, was Michael LeMaitre. Unlike Penny, Michael wasn't anywhere close to contention for a winner's spot in 2012. When he was younger, he was a keen runner, nearly going to Syracuse University on a track running scholarship. By then, though, he was a 66-year-old businessman, and despite still being fit, he wasn't the fastest of runners. But he was the sort of man who liked to challenge and doing things that seemed different, even crazy to his family, especially if it looked like fun. And even though he'd been told to at least walk the route before the day of the event, he never did, and so the day of the race was his first time going up the mountain. Either way, he set off filled with confidence at 3 p.m., but by 5 p.m., long after the fastest runners had finished, he still hadn't even reached the halfway point at the summit, and he was struggling. The last time anyone saw him, he was 200 feet from the top of the mountain. Then, just before 6 p.m., one of the race volunteers had spotted a straggler who wanted to know if he would still be able to finish, even though he was so slow. The volunteer told him that everyone is allowed to run at their own speed and asked for his bib number, and then radioed the volunteers below to say the last runner was about to reach the turnaround point and he should be with them in an hour and a half or so. Meanwhile, Michael's wife Peggy waited at the finish line for her husband. She knew he wouldn't be quick, but she'd still be proud of him for completing the race. First, the top competitors crossed the finish line, then the slower runners came in, sometimes in groups, sometimes one at a time. Then after a while, she was waiting for so long that the organizers were starting to close the race down and pack up the finish line. But she still wasn't worried. Even though the event seemed to be over, some people were still turning up. Peggy assumed the organizers knew who was still out there and they wouldn't leave completely until Michael was back. But Michael never crossed the finish line. The hour-and-a-half estimate given by the volunteer passed, and then the day drew into night. Peggy then started to ask around to see if anyone had seen Michael. She was also soaked and cold, so she got into her car and began to honk her horn and shout Michael's name, hoping the noise would guide him down. Tragically, it didn't. Michael had vanished. After he was officially reported missing, the Alaska State Troopers and the Fire and Rescue Department began an extensive search of the mountain. Michael's daughters also helped in the search, and one of them even arranged for a specialist cadaver dog to be flown all the way from Oregon to follow the path of the race. But the dog didn't find a single trace of her dad anywhere. One of Michael's friends also paid for a helicopter to fly over the mountain and take both high-resolution and thermal imaging photos. But again, despite hours of thorough combing the mountainside, there was just nothing. By the end of July, the official search was abandoned, but that didn't stop people who lived in Seward from carrying on. One report claims that on the weekend after the official search was called off, dozens of people, possibly hundreds, went up the mountain to search for the missing man. The searchers also hoped that when fall came and the dense foliage thinned out, Michael's body might be easier to spot. But they just never found a trace. So the question is, what happened to Michael? One possibility is that he was mauled by a bear. People have reported seeing bears or even running from bears during the race before. In 2017, there were back-to-back attacks by bears in the area, including an attack on a 16-year-old runner who got lost competing in another race not far from Anchorage. But because they never found Michael, there's no way to know if the same thing happened to him. In all likelihood, he just got lost. Michael didn't have the best eyesight. He suffered from advanced glaucoma that destroyed his peripheral vision and narrowed his eyesight so badly that he once called it a disability. Even for someone with 20/20 vision on a clear day, the mountain marathon race is a tough route to follow. There are even spots on the mountain that hikers have had to be rescued from in sunny weather. On a damp, foggy day like July 4th, 2012, his poor vision could have taken him down the wrong side of the mountain, where he could have just slipped and fallen into a ravine never to be found. But even if he did get lost, as is often the case with disappearances like this, it's still hard to fathom how someone can disappear so completely in such a short period of time. In a race with hundreds of others on a relatively short, frequently traveled path, it seems impossible that there would be no trace of someone after such an intense search with thermal imaging and scent dogs. Either way, Michael's disappearance would change the rules of the race. Now, if you can't make it to the halfway point up the mountain in an hour, you're forced to turn around and go back down again. Runners also have to sign a statement saying they've run the course before, either in a previous year or by going on one of the 2 training runs held in the run-up to the event. The race has also been rerouted, avoiding the dangerous cliffs where Penny and Matthew fell, but still, as of 2023, there was no sign of Michael. When Mildred Young checked her answering machine on Wednesday, April 15th, 1998, she hoped the call she'd missed would be from her daughter Diane. Diane had gone missing a week earlier, and Mildred was worried not only because Diane usually kept in touch, but also because she had a long history of mental illness. At 40 years old, she'd already been committed to mental health facilities 32 times, and her inability to function on her own meant she was constantly getting booked for petty crimes and misdemeanors like shoplifting. Almost 2 decades earlier, Diane was married with 3 kids and was described as being a doting housewife and mother with a perfectly kept house. Unfortunately, over the next few years, Diane began to spiral. 10 years into her marriage, she was diagnosed with manic depression, now known as bipolar disorder. She was given medication to help with her illness, but whenever she felt better, she stopped taking her medication, thinking she didn't need it anymore. That created a vicious cycle that eventually caused her husband to leave her in 1988, taking the kids with him and finally divorcing her in 1991. Afterward, Diane began to spiral further and began to self-medicate with alcohol instead of taking her prescribed medication. This is when she started getting into more serious trouble. When she did, the state would often take her into care using Florida's Baker Act, which allows someone to be put into a mental health facility if they become a danger to themselves or others. Sadly, it operated the same way Diane's prescriptions did. Whenever she seemed fine, they'd let her go, ending her treatment. Then Diane would begin acting as if she had before until she was picked up again for something new and the cycle would continue. On the day she disappeared, which was Friday, April 10th, she was staying with her sister Deborah. Deborah left to go to a dentist appointment at 10 a.m. and when she returned home, Diane was gone. It was later learned that from her sister's house, she went to a bar in Hudson, Florida. It's not clear how she got there because it was about 10 miles and Diane didn't have a car. Either way, after arriving at the bar, she had a few drinks, but then shortly afterward began walking in circles repeatedly. The bartender then refused to serve her, thinking she had too much to drink. Then after leaving the bar, she might have been seen in 2 local restaurants. The following day, she was seen walking north on a road near New York Avenue. Then she checked in and stayed at the Coral Sands Motel until the 14th. Now, the Coral Sands Motel was a bit of a dump. It was mostly falling down, and it was known to attract seedy individuals and those hard on their luck because it was cheap. It was sort of the last place you'd want to get to know people. Then she seems to have left the motel on the 14th. Mildred didn't know any of this, as she was going to check the message on her answering machine the following day on the 15th. All she knew was that her daughter had disappeared on the 10th and had not been seen or heard from since. Then she pressed the button to listen to the message, and to her relief, she began to hear Diane's voice. Unfortunately, the relief was quickly replaced by pure terror. All Diane said was, "Help, let me out," and she sounded tense and was practically shouting into the phone. Then there was the sound of scuffling, as if someone were trying to pry the phone out of Diane's hands. Then another voice could be heard saying, "Hey, gimme that." Then there was a click as the call hung up. Mildred immediately checked the caller ID, and it said the call had come from somewhere called Starlight, so she called the number back, but there was no answer. Unfortunately, wherever or whatever Starlight was, it's never been discovered. Some people on forums have suggested that it might have been a strip bar called Starlight or the Starlight Motel, but again, it's never been determined, at least publicly. Obviously, instead of making Mildred feel better, the message made her more scared than ever. She was sure something terrible had happened to her daughter, and everything that's come out since then seems to indicate that to be the case. Diane was possibly seen for the last time on the 15th eating lunch at another hotel in the area. That evening, a woman walking to work in Hudson headed up New York Avenue a few miles from where Diane was supposedly seen eating lunch. As she walked, she saw what looked like a fake finger, like the kind you'd get at a novelty store. It had a nail painted bright red and was just left at the side of the road. The woman then continued walking, but the more she thought about it throughout the day, the more it bothered her, so she asked her boyfriend to go look the following day. Horrifyingly, it wasn't a joke finger, it was real. It was then brought to police, who identified it as Diane's finger. They had her fingerprints on record from the many times she'd been arrested, and it was determined to be her right middle finger. Right away, police knew foul play was most likely, but they had to consider other options. They couldn't be sure if this was done maliciously or if Diane had somehow hurt herself, like closing her finger on a car door. Unfortunately, things only got stranger from there. Later that day, a convenience store owner was tidying up out front of her store and decided to check her outdoor freezer. It had been 3 weeks or so since she'd looked inside, and the local kids sometimes left things in there she had to remove. When she looked inside, she found a bag, and inside the bag were some neatly folded clothes. Incredibly, they looked familiar. She recognized them as Diane's clothes because Diane was a regular at the store. She then called Deborah, and when Deborah arrived, she also recognized the clothes as one she had actually given Diane. However, police were quick to point out that some kids who lived near Diane's house had broken in not long after she'd gone missing. Diane often allowed parties in her house, and quite a lot of her possessions had been stolen, probably by partygoers who knew what was in there. Whoever it was could have dumped the clothes at the store, but strangely, they were neatly folded and left where someone would recognize them. It seems unlikely this would have been done by some random kids. Either way, this was the last clue for the next 2 years. Police spoke to hundreds of people and followed dozens of leads, but nothing went anywhere. The only real suspect they had during this time period was the manager at the Coral Sands Motel, Gary Robert Evers, although police have never said why he was a suspect during this time. He'll become more important in just a second. On November 24, 2000, 2 years after Diane's disappearance, the Tampa Bay Times published a routine update on the case. The following day, Diane's brother's girlfriend, Terry, went into a Circle K to buy something. Inside, she noticed a clear plastic Ziploc bag with makeup, perfume, and toothpaste on the lottery counter. Then she noticed it had the name Diane written on it in black Sharpie. In addition, Diane used that shade of pink lipstick, that black eyeliner, and the perfume in the bag. The toothpaste also matched what was given to Diane in the hospital a few weeks before she went missing. It's hard to know if this was just another coincidence, but if it wasn't a coincidence, that means someone must have been watching Terry long enough to know her habits. Frustratingly, the Circle K had taped over these surveillance tapes by the time the police were notified and came to check the footage. That wasn't unusual because VHS tapes were expensive and stores would routinely tape over the previous day's recordings to save money. So unfortunately, they couldn't get anything from the bag or its contents either, so the trail went cold again. The final clue in the case before it went completely cold came on June 28, 2001, just before midnight. The one suspect, Gary Robert Evers, confronted a man at the Coral Sands Motel. The night before, 2 men in ski masks had burst into the motel's office and attacked the manager of the motel, who was also Gary's girlfriend. Gary ran at them, but then they ran away before he could catch them. The following day, Gary confronted a man who he thought was involved, and when the man refused to say who else was with him, Gary took out his gun and shot him several times. It later turned out that the man had nothing to do with it after all, after the real attackers gave themselves up. Either way, this gave police a chance to question Gary in more detail about his possible involvement in Diane's case, but it didn't lead anywhere. Gary was later convicted of murder in the office, but they couldn't prove any link between Gary and Diane other than the fact that he booked her into a room. So that is where the case is today. What we know is that Diane was going through some serious issues and often found herself mingling with some not so great people. The most troubling part of her disappearance is obviously the finger that was found on the side of the road. This, in combination with the phone call to her mother, seems to indicate that something terrible happened to her. But then equally confusing are the items that were found that belonged to her. Again, they seem too perfectly placed to be a coincidence. Today, Diane is still listed as a missing person, and as of 2024, she would be 64 years old. So, what do you think happened? Each of these cases seems to have an entirely different likely explanation, and yet they are all equally confusing. In any case, if you have a story suggestion that you'd like to see covered or you think would fit the channel, I'd love to hear it, and you could submit it to the form found in the description. Thanks so much for tuning in, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.